You didn't just break a promise, Grandma. You stole my mother's entire life, and this letter is the proof. The words, sharp and cold as shattered glass, hung in the warm air of my dining room. My granddaughter Charlotte stood across the polished oak table, her knuckles white as she clutched a yellowed piece of paper. Her face, usually just a pale reflection of her mother's bitterness, was ablaze with a righteous fury I had never seen in her. Around the table my family was frozen. David's hand hovered over his water glass. Eleanor's fork clattered softly onto her plate, and even little Benjamin, the artist, looked up from his sketchpad, his gentle eyes wide with shock. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary, a scent that had meant comfort and unity for 50 years, suddenly felt like a suffocating lie. In that moment, I was not their loving matriarch. I was a queen on her chessboard, suddenly and brutally placed in check by a pawn I had never seen as a threat. Mary's voice softens, becoming intimate and warm. Oh, my dears. Welcome back to my little corner of memory. Before we delve into the heart of this storm, find a comfortable chair. Perhaps pour yourself a cup of tea. It brings me such warmth to know you are here with me. If you enjoy our time together, do press that little like button and subscribe, so you don't miss a single chapter of our family's long journey. And please tell me in the comments what city you're listening from. It makes the world feel a little smaller, knowing our stories are connecting us across the miles. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of that day. A day that began with the softest of sunbeams and ended with the sharpest of truths. The day of the accusation began like any other Sunday. The old house sighed around me as it woke, the floorboards groaning a familiar melody under my feet. I always woke before the sun, in that quiet, blue-hued hour when the world feels like it's holding its breath. My first ritual was to go to the window in my bedroom, the one that overlooks the garden Arthur planted for me. Even now, decades after he's been gone, his roses still climb the old stone wall, their scent a faint, sweet ghost in the morning air. I traced the condensation on the cool glass, my thoughts, as they so often did, turning to him. Arthur, my brilliant, charming, and sometimes foolishly kind husband. A man who loved peace so much he would sometimes promise the moon to avoid a moment's conflict. It was his greatest virtue and his most dangerous flaw. Downstairs, the kitchen was my sanctuary. The scent of coffee brewing, rich and dark, mingled with the lingering smell of beeswax from polishing the furniture yesterday. I ran my hand over the great oak table, its surface a map of our family's life, marked with the nicks from a toddler's fork, a faint ring from a spilled glass of celebratory wine, and even a tiny, almost invisible scar from where my son Samuel had carved his initials as a rebellious teenager. Every mark was a memory, a testament to the love and the chaos that had filled these walls. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, arrived soon after, her smile as warm as the fresh bread she carried. She is David's wife, and she has a soul woven from loyalty. Unlike some of the others who married into this family, Jessica never sought power or position. She sought a home. "Morning, Mary," she said, kissing my cheek. "I brought your favorite, the seeded rye. I thought Charlotte and Veronica might be coming today, and it's best to be armed with comfort." I smiled, but her words pricked a small bubble of unease in my chest. "You think they will come?" Jessica shrugged, her hands already busy slicing the bread. "Charlotte called David last night. She was asking odd questions about your early years with Arthur, about the old properties." My hand stilled over the biscuit dough I was kneading. David, my eldest, had spent years consumed by greed, a sickness of the soul from which he was now thankfully recovering. But any mention of property or inheritance still put a knot in my stomach. It was a language that had brought so much pain into our family. "What sort of questions?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Just details." She sounded intense. David said she had a tone he hadn't heard since before he learned his lessons about money. The reference hung in the air between us. We both knew the battles David had fought with himself, the betrayals he had committed in the name of wealth before finding his way back. Was that same restless hunger now stirring in his niece, Charlotte? I had always felt a pang of sorrow for Charlotte. She was born in the shadow of her mother, Veronica, a woman who wore her disappointments like a heavy cloak. Veronica had married my envious son, Samuel, and their union was a long, slow study in mutual resentment. Charlotte grew up in a house where love was a transaction and affection was measured against success. She looked at her cousins, Emily, Benjamin Catherine, and saw only what she lacked. Her envy was a quiet, simmering thing, not the fiery greed of her Uncle David, but a colder, more patient resentment. I had tried over the years to draw her into the warmth, but she always remained on the periphery, watching, calculating. By midday, the family began to arrive. Eleanor, my ever-organized daughter, came first, immediately beginning to rearrange the flowers I had set out. A habit of control she was finally learning to soften into an act of care. James, my secret son, the product of a painful choice I made long ago, arrived with his family. His presence a quiet testament to the fact that love can heal even the deepest wounds. He and his half-siblings now shared a tentative peace, a fragile bridge built over decades of silence. Seeing them all together, my redeemed children, David and Eleanor and Samuel, my gentle Benjamin, my pragmatic Catherine, my long-lost James, filled my heart with a fierce protective love that was almost painful. They were my flawed, beautiful, chaotic legacy. The last to arrive were Veronica and Charlotte. They stepped into the house not with the cheerful bustle of family, but with the chilling formality of emissaries from a rival kingdom. Veronica gave me a thin, brittle smile, her eyes scanning the room, tallying up the perceived slights. But it was Charlotte who drew my attention. The simmering envy in her eyes had been replaced by something harder, something colder. She held her handbag in front of her like a shield, and I knew, with the unerring instinct of a mother who has weathered 100 storms, that she was carrying a weapon inside it. We sat down to dinner. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by the awkward silences that fall when something important is being left unsaid. I watched Charlotte push a piece of chicken around her plate, her jaw tight. She was waiting. And as I looked at her, a memory flickered at the edge of my mind. A memory of Arthur, sitting at this very table, his face etched with worry, making a promise to a young, hopeful Veronica. A promise I had long since forgotten. A promise he never should have made. The past, I have learned, is never truly gone. It simply waits for its moment to return. And Charlotte, my bitter, wounded granddaughter, was about to become its messenger. Of course. Let us return to that table, to the precise moment the fragile peace began to splinter. The air in the dining room grew thick with unspoken things. I watched Charlotte across the table, her fork moving aimlessly through her mashed potatoes. It was my daughter Eleanor who inadvertently lit the fuse. With a contented sigh, she looked around the room, at the faces of her siblings and their children, and smiled. It is moments like these, she said, her voice filled with a newfound, gentle peace she had fought so hard to win, that I truly appreciate the legacy Mama and Papa built. This house, this family, it's a fortress. Charlotte's head snapped up. Her eyes, which had been downcast and sullen, now held a dangerous gleam. A fortress? She repeated, her voice dripping with a sarcasm so cold it made the silver on the table feel warm. Or a prison? It all depends on which side of the wall you're on, doesn't it? Veronica placed a warning hand on her daughter's arm, but Charlotte shook it off. This was a performance, and the curtain had just gone up. Samuel, her father, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had lived his whole life feeling like he was on the wrong side of that wall, and his daughter had learned her lessons from him well. Charlotte, that's enough, David said, his voice firm but tired. He had no more patience for the family's old grievances. No, it's not enough, Charlotte shot back, pushing her chair back and rising to her feet. I have spent my entire life watching my mother be treated like a second-class citizen in this family. Watching her dreams get swept aside while the rest of you thrived in this fortress. My heart ached, not for the accusation, which I knew was coming, but for the poison that had been fed to this girl, drop by drop, since the day she was born. Veronica was now dabbing at her eyes with a napkin, a perfect portrait of tragic motherhood. And now, Charlotte continued, her voice rising with theatrical fervor as she reached into her handbag. I finally know why. She pulled out the letter. It was old, the envelope brittle and brown with age. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized the paper, the spidery, elegant slant of my husband's handwriting. It was from a box of his old things I had stored in the attic, a place I had not visited in years. How had she found it? I was in the attic last week, she said, as if reading my mind, looking for old photo albums, and I found a box of Grandpa Arthur's things, his university papers, some medals, and this. She held the letter aloft like a holy relic or a hangman's noose. A letter he wrote to my mother, a month before she and my father were married. Silence. The entire family stared, first at the letter, then at me. I could feel their questions, their doubts swirling around me. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my posture straight. A queen does not flinch. He wrote it to comfort her, Charlotte said, her voice now trembling with manufactured rage, because she was worried. Worried about starting a life with a man who felt he was always in his older brother's shadow. Worried about where they would live. And this is what her future father-in-law, my grandfather, promised her. She unfolded the paper with deliberate, agonizing slowness, and then she read the words that would ignite the fire. My dearest Veronica. She read, her voice clear and cutting, do not worry your pretty head about the future. I give you my word that the little cottage by the lake will be yours and Samuel's on your wedding day, a place to start your lives away from all this noise. Mary agrees it's for the best. The words landed like stones in the quiet room. Samuel looked up at me, his face a mixture of confusion and a slow, dawning, familiar resentment. He promised us the lake cottage? He whispered, looking to his wife. Veronica simply nodded, a single, perfect tear rolling down her cheek, and then Charlotte looked directly at me, her eyes blazing with the fire of a prosecutor who has just presented her final, irrefutable piece of evidence. That is when she spoke the words I shared with you at the beginning. You didn't just break a promise, Grandma. You stole my mother's entire life, and this letter is the proof. The room erupted. David was on his feet demanding an explanation. Eleanor was trying to calm him, her face pale with shock. Jessica moved instinctively to my side, her hand resting on my shoulder, a small warm anchor in the hurricane. But I was barely there. The letter, the words, had thrown me backwards in time, into a memory I had sealed away for 3 decades. I wasn't in my warm, comfortable dining room anymore. I was standing on the damp, mossy porch of that little lake cottage, the air thick with the scent of pine and impending rain. Arthur was beside me, his shoulders slumped in defeat. And inside the cottage, I could hear the sounds of a life I could not have imagined. A secret he had kept, a debt he could not pay. The promise he made to Veronica was not a gift he was offering. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to put out one fire while another, much larger one, threatened to consume him. He had made the promise to Veronica because he was weak at that moment, terrified of her tears and Samuel's complaints. He had used my name, Mary agrees, to give his promise weight, a tactic he used when he knew he was on unsteady ground. He never told me he had written it down. The full, ugly truth was this. Arthur had lost the cottage in a foolish business deal weeks before he wrote that letter. He had been trying to hide the financial ruin of a friend, and in doing so had nearly dragged us down with him. The cottage was not his to give. He had promised Veronica a house he no longer owned, and I was the one who had to clean up the mess. I was the one who had to work for 2 years, taking on sewing and baking for other families, to pay back the debts and keep our own home from being taken. I had to let the cottage go, selling it to the very man Arthur had tried to save, just to keep our family afloat. I had never told Samuel or Veronica the truth. I had allowed them to believe the cottage was sold for practical reasons, to fund another of David's early business ventures. It was a lie, a merciful lie. How could I tell my already envious son that his father had been a fool? That he had gambled away their inheritance out of a misguided sense of honor? It would have destroyed Samuel's memory of his father. So I chose peace over truth. I bore their resentment in silence to protect Arthur's legacy. I carried the burden of being the pragmatic, unfeeling matriarch who sold their dream house from under them. And now, 30 years later, that merciful lie had returned as a venomous truth in the hands of my granddaughter. I looked at Charlotte's triumphant face, then at Veronica's martyred tears, and at my son Samuel's wounded expression. I could destroy them with the truth. I could tell them about Arthur's failure, about the near bankruptcy, about the shame he carried to his grave. I could expose Veronica's early manipulations, her uncanny ability to cry whenever she wanted something Arthur couldn't provide. I could explain everything. It would be justice. My justice. But what would it cost? It would shatter the flawless image they held of their sainted husband and father. It would reveal Samuel's marriage to be founded on a lie he had used to nurse his resentment for 30 years. It would be a truth so devastating it might break the family forever. I took a slow, deep breath, the scent of rosemary and betrayal filling my lungs. I looked past Charlotte, past the anger and the pain, and met the wounded eyes of my son, Samuel. Then I let my gaze settle on Charlotte. My voice, when I finally spoke, was calm and clear, cutting through the chaos. "There is a truth to this letter, Charlotte," I said, my words silencing the room. "But it is not the truth you are telling. You have opened a door to a room that has been sealed for 30 years. Are you truly prepared to see what is inside?" My question hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The simmering chaos in the room instantly cooled into a tense, fragile silence. Every eye was on me. Charlotte, who had been so incandescent with fury, now looked like a child who had set a fire she did not know how to extinguish. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. Her simple story of heroes and villains, a noble grandfather, a victimized mother, a cruel grandmother, was being threatened. "What do you mean?" She stammered, her voice much smaller now. "The letter is clear. He promised her the house. You sold it." "The letter," I said, my voice soft but unyielding, "is a single sentence in a very long and complicated story. A story none of you have ever heard." I let my gaze travel from Charlotte to her mother, Veronica, whose performance of a wounded dove was beginning to look strained. Then I looked at Samuel, my son, his face a canvas of confusion and old hurts. "Tell me, Samuel, do you remember the year you were married? The spring of 1988. Do you remember what your father was like then?" Samuel blinked, caught off guard by the question. He was fine. Stressed, maybe. He was working on that new development project downtown. "He was more than stressed," I said, the memory rising in me, sharp and bitter. "He was drowning, and he was hiding it from all of you because he never wanted his children to see him as anything less than invincible." David, ever the businessman, leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What are you talking about, Mama?" "Dad's accounts were solid. I saw the books after he passed. The downtown project was a huge success." "Yes," I agreed. "It was eventually. But in the spring of 1988, it was a black hole, swallowing every penny we had. Your father, in his great kindness, had entered into a partnership with his old friend, Mr. Harrison. And Mr. Harrison, a good man but a terrible gambler, had made a series of catastrophic mistakes. Your father was trying to save him. He was funneling our own money into the project to keep it from collapsing and taking his friend's reputation down with it." The family exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the history they knew. The official story was one of Arthur's unerring business acumen, a narrative I had carefully maintained for 3 decades. He didn't tell me the full extent of it until it was almost too late. I continued, my voice dropping as I remembered the fear of those days. The sleepless nights, the carefully cheerful facade I had to maintain at dinners just like this one. He would come home late, smelling of stale coffee and worry. He lost weight. He thought he could fix it all himself. He always did. I looked at Veronica, whose face had gone rigid. "He wrote you that letter, my dear, during the worst week of that crisis. The very week the bank called to tell us they were considering freezing our assets." Veronica paled. That's not true. He was perfectly happy when he gave it to me. We had tea at the plaza. "A man like your father," I said gently, "was a master of appearances. He would have sooner cut off his own arm than let a young woman he was fond of see him sweat. He saw you were worried about your future with Samuel, and in a moment of desperate generosity, of wanting to be the hero he felt he was failing to be in his own life, he promised you a dream. A beautiful, impossible dream." The room was utterly still. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to be holding its breath. The proof Charlotte had wielded so proudly was beginning to feel less like a weapon and more like a shard of a broken mirror, reflecting only a tiny, distorted piece of the truth. "So, what are you saying?" Charlotte asked, her voice a whisper now. "That he lied?" I chose my next words with the care of a surgeon. This was the most dangerous part. "I am saying," I began, looking not at Charlotte but directly at my son, Samuel, "that your father was a man of immense love and immense pride. I am saying that on the day he wrote that letter, he was facing the possibility of losing everything, this house, his business, his reputation. And I am saying that the lake cottage was the first price we had to pay to begin to climb out of that hole. I left the crucial part unsaid, that the cottage was already gone when he wrote the letter. That his promise was not just impossible, it was a complete fiction, a phantom gift. I would let that piece of the truth wait. First, they had to absorb this new reality. They had to see Arthur not as a saint, but as a man. A flawed, frightened, and loving man. Jessica, my loyal daughter-in-law, finally spoke, her voice filled with a dawning comprehension. So you didn't sell it to fund David's business. You sold it to save the family. I simply nodded, my eyes still locked with Samuel's. For 30 years, he had believed I had favored his brother over him. For 30 years, his wife had nurtured that grievance, watering it daily with her own bitterness. For 30 years, they had built their unhappy lives on the foundation of a lie I had told them out of love, and a promise Arthur had made them out of fear. Charlotte sank back into her chair, the letter lying forgotten on the table. The righteous fire in her was gone, replaced by the gray ash of confusion. She had come for justice, for a grand victory. But the room was not filled with the thrill of a battle won. It was filled with a deep, echoing sadness. The ghost in the garden was no longer just Arthur's sweet memory. It was the ghost of a terrible secret, and it had finally found its way back into the house. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the tense, sharp-edged silence of a standoff, but the thick, heavy silence of a graveyard. We were all mourning the death of a story we had believed for 30 years. The story of an infallible father, of a simple injustice, of a clearly drawn map of heroes and villains. In its place was a tangled, thorny wilderness, and none of us knew the way through. It was my son, Samuel, who finally broke it. He had been staring at his hands resting on the oak table, as if seeing them for the first time. When he looked up at me, the envy that had clouded his eyes for most of his adult life was gone. In its place was something far more painful, a profound, bottomless sorrow. "Why?" he asked, his voice raspy, broken. "Mother, why? Why let us believe it? For 30 years I thought you saw me as less, that you chose David over me. Veronica and I, our whole life has been shaped by that story. Why carry that burden? Why let us carry that hate?" The question was not an accusation. It was a plea. He wasn't asking as an angry son, but as a lost child. Before I could answer, Veronica, seeing her narrative and her power dissolving, tried to reclaim the battlefield. "He's right, Mary," she said, her voice sharp. The victim's tears replaced by the acid of a woman whose justification for her own bitterness was being stripped away. So Arthur was in some trouble. Men of his stature always are. It doesn't change the fact that a promise was made. He gave his word, our word. It was written down. She gestured toward the letter as if it were still a sacred text and not a monument to a lie. I looked at her, and for a moment, I felt a flash of the old anger. But it passed, leaving only a great weariness. She was not a monster. She was just a small, frightened woman who had built her entire identity around a single wound. Without it, who was she? I turned my attention back to Samuel, my son. He deserved the real answer. "When you were a boy," I began, my voice soft, pulling the memory from the deepest part of my heart. "About 7 years old, your father took you fishing at that lake. Do you remember?" Samuel's brow furrowed, then cleared. "I remember. I caught a tiny perch. He told me it was the size of a whale." I smiled, a real smile, though it was laced with pain. "He did. You were so proud. You carried it home in a little bucket, but on the walk back you tripped on a root and fell, spilling the bucket. The fish was gone, back in the grass somewhere. You started to cry, not because you were hurt, but because you had lost your prize." I could see the memory returning to him, his eyes distant. "And Papa?" "And Papa," I finished for him, "knelt down, wiped your tears, and spent the next half hour searching in the tall grass until he found that tiny, silly fish for you. He put it back in the bucket, filled it with water from his canteen, and told you that a good man never gives up on what he's caught. He carried you on his shoulders the rest of the way home." I paused, letting the warmth of that memory fill the cold room. "That is the man your father was," I said quietly. "A man who would go to any lengths to keep his son from feeling the sting of failure. A man who would rather search in the weeds for a lost fish than admit defeat." I leaned forward slightly, my gaze holding Samuel's. "Now you ask me why I didn't tell you the truth about the cottage. I will ask you this. What would it have done to your 7-year-old heart to know that your father, your hero, sometimes tripped on the root? What would it have done to your 25-year-old heart to know that he hadn't just tripped? He had fallen so hard he almost lost everything we had. I did not tell you the truth because I was trying to protect your father's legacy. But more than that, my son, I was trying to protect your memory of the man who would always, always find your fish for you. I chose to let you resent me rather than let you be disappointed in him. It was a matriarch's choice, a mother's burden. It was a grace I chose to give him, and a price I chose to pay. A tear traced a path down Samuel's weathered cheek. He understood. In that moment, 30 years of bitterness washed away, leaving the raw, clean wound of a shared family sorrow. He looked at his wife, Veronica, and for the first time, I saw not resentment, but pity in his eyes. He was seeing her, truly seeing her for the first time. But Veronica would not be pitied. She would not surrender her grievance. "That's a very pretty story, Mary," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "A very noble sacrifice. But it doesn't change the words on the paper." He promised it to me. He looked me in the eye and promised it. Are you saying his word meant nothing? I looked at her, and I knew that the partial truth was not enough. The bandage would not hold. The wound had to be cauterized with the final terrible fire. The lie had to be burned away completely for any of them to truly heal. I had protected Arthur's memory for 30 years. But perhaps the greatest grace I could offer my children now was the whole, unvarnished, painful truth. I took a deep breath. This would hurt. This would change everything again. "You are right, Veronica," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying the weight of the final secret. "A promise is a promise, but a man cannot promise what he no longer has to give." I let that hang in the air for a beat, watching her face, watching her mind refuse to comprehend where I was going. "When Arthur wrote you that letter," I said, "delivering the final blow, when he sat with you at the plaza and looked you in the eye and promised you the world, we hadn't owned the lake cottage for nearly a month. Excelente. We have arrived at the final painful turn. Let us now witness the aftermath of a truth that has been buried for 30 years. If my previous revelation had filled the room with the silence of a graveyard, this final truth left it with the silence of the void. The sound of a man promising something he did not have was the sound of utter desperation, of a profound and pathetic deceit. The letter lying on the center of the table no longer seemed like a relic of a promise broken, but a sad artifact of a man's broken pride. Veronica stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. All the fight, all the righteous indignation, all the carefully nurtured bitterness drained from her face, leaving behind a slack, empty mask. For 3 decades, she had defined her life by the grandeur of what was stolen from her. The beautiful lakeside cottage, the idyllic life she was denied. To learn now that the prize was never real, that the promise was a ghost from the moment it was spoken, was to learn that she had been the curator of a museum with no artifacts. Her grievance, the very core of her identity, had evaporated. She had nothing left. She slowly sank back into her chair, a hollowed-out woman, finally and irrevocably silenced. The gaze of the family then shifted to Charlotte. She looked from her mother's empty face to my own, and her expression was one of absolute horror. She had come here as a champion of justice, a warrior for her mother's stolen legacy. Now she saw herself for what she was, a foolish girl who had mistaken a ghost story for history and, in her arrogant crusade, had unleashed a pain far deeper and more complex than she could ever have imagined. Her eyes filled with tears, real tears this time, born not of manufactured rage but of a deep and gut-wrenching shame. "Grandma," she whispered, the word catching in her throat. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I just wanted her to be happy." My heart, which had been braced for battle, now broke for her. I rose from my chair, my old bones protesting, and walked around the table. I did not go to Samuel, my son. I did not go to Veronica, my antagonist. I went to my granddaughter. I placed my hand on her shaking shoulder. "I know you did," I said softly. "You loved your mother and you wanted to slay a dragon for her. But you must be careful, my child. Sometimes when you go looking for dragons, you find only the sad, frightened men who created them." I looked across the table at the portrait of Arthur on the mantelpiece, his handsome, smiling face a mask for the terror he must have felt. I felt a surge of love for him so powerful it almost took my breath away. Love for his strength and love for his weakness. "Your grandfather was a great man," I said to the room, my voice resonating with a strength they had not heard from me before. "But he was not a god. He was a man who loved his family so fiercely that the thought of failing them was more terrifying than death. The letter he wrote was not a promise. It was a prayer, a desperate prayer that a miracle would happen, that he could somehow spin a dream out of thin air to comfort a girl he cared about, to keep his son from feeling poor. It was the act of a proud, drowning man trying to hand out life rafts he did not possess. I then walked to where Veronica sat, still staring into nothingness. I reached down and took her cold, limp hand in my own. She did not resist. "Veronica," I said, my voice gentle but firm, "for 30 years you have lived in a house that was never built. You have grieved a life that was never possible. It has made you bitter, and it has poisoned your daughter. That house is now finally gone. The foundation was a phantom. It is time to stop mourning a ghost." I squeezed her hand. "Let us build a new house together, all of us. Not on the shifting sands of past promises, but on the solid, rocky ground of this painful, complicated truth. It will not be as pretty as the dream cottage, but it will be real, and it will stand." For the first time in 30 years, Veronica looked at me without a veil of resentment. She saw not a rival, not a matriarch who had slighted her, but an old woman who had carried an impossible burden to protect her. She gave a single, shuddering nod. The storm had passed. The dining room was no longer a battlefield, but a place of quiet, somber healing. Samuel went to his wife's side, placing a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of shared loss and a new fragile beginning. The family would never be the same. The perfect portrait of Arthur was gone forever. In its place was something far more real and far more valuable. The complicated truth of a family that had survived its own secrets. Mary's voice shifts, becoming warmer, more reflective, as if speaking to a dear friend. "And so, my dears, the ghost that haunted our family for a generation was finally laid to rest. Truth, you see, can be a harsh and blinding light, but it is also the only thing that can truly disinfect our oldest wounds. Forgiveness is not about forgetting. It is about remembering and choosing to love anyway, a title of profound weight. A house is never just a house. It is a library of whispers, a silent witness to every joy and every sorrow. Very well. Let us see what these old walls remember. Here is the first part of the story. This house is not an inheritance, Benjamin. It is a promise I made to your dying father, and you will not force me to break it." My voice did not tremble. In the heart of a hurricane, there is a place of absolute stillness, and I was in it. We stood in Arthur's old study, the room that had always been the soul of our home, surrounded by the scent of old leather and his favorite pipe tobacco that still clung to the velvet curtains. My son, my gentle Benjamin, the artist, the one I had always believed to be above the family's battles for power and money, stood before me holding a sheaf of legal papers. A deed. His siblings, David, Eleanor, Samuel, stood behind him, their faces a mixture of disbelief and horror. This was not a chaotic dinner table accusation like Charlotte's. This was a quiet, cold, and calculated coup, and it was being led by the one son I never thought I would have to guard my heart against. Mary's voice softens, becoming a familiar warm welcome. "Oh, hello again, my dears. I'm so glad you have returned. It seems the storms in this family are never far apart, do they? Find your comfortable spot and let us journey back together. As always, your presence here warms my old heart. If you would be so kind as to press that little like button and subscribe, you will be sure to have a place by the fire for every memory I share. And do tell me in the comments what city you are listening from tonight. Knowing our community stretches from corner to corner of this wide world is a comfort indeed. Now, let me tell you how the gentlest of my children came to hold a dagger to the heart of our home. The months following Charlotte's painful revelation were a time of fragile, tender healing. The truth about Arthur's promise, or lack thereof, had acted like a surgeon's scalpel, cutting away a 30-year-old sickness. The surgery was brutal, but the recovery was real. Veronica, stripped of her defining grievance, was quieter, more watchful. She began for the first time to actually see the family around her, not just the slights she imagined they had dealt. Samuel, freed from the lie that he was the less loved son, seemed to stand straighter. He and David even began talking again, not as rivals, but as brothers who had both, in their own ways, been lost and found. The peace was new. It was precious, and like all precious things, I guarded it fiercely. In this quiet season, my son Benjamin was my constant comfort. While my other children were out in the world, wrestling with their businesses, their marriages, their own complicated legacies, Benjamin was always here. He was the keeper of the house's quiet rhythms. I would wake to the faint, pleasant scent of turpentine from his studio in the converted sunroom. I would find him in the garden, sketching the very roses Arthur had planted, his charcoal-smudged fingers capturing their beauty with a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes. He never wanted for much. While David had craved wealth and Eleanor had craved control, Benjamin craved only light and shadow. He saw the world not as a thing to be conquered, but as a thing to be captured on canvas. His lack of worldly ambition was, I thought, his greatest strength. He was my peaceful son, my gentle son, my harbor. That is why I did not at first see the signs. It began subtly. He started spending hours in Arthur's study, a room he had generally avoided, finding its dark wood and heavy books oppressive to his artistic spirit. I would find him there late at night, not reading but simply sitting in Arthur's leather chair, staring at the walls as if trying to memorize their patterns. I assumed he was simply connecting with his father's memory, and my heart swelled at the thought. Then came the letters. Official-looking envelopes addressed to him from a law firm downtown I did not recognize. When I asked, he was evasive. Just sorting some of Dad's old papers, Mama, estate details. Nothing for you to worry about. And I foolishly believed him. Why would I not? This was Benjamin, the son who had held my hand through every crisis. The one who had never asked for anything. The true warning sign. The one that my soul registered even if my mind dismissed it, came one Tuesday afternoon. I was in the kitchen, humming an old tune and kneading dough for bread, when Benjamin came in. He didn't come for a cup of tea or to steal a piece of fruit. He stood in the doorway watching me. What is it, my love? I asked, smiling. He just shook his head, a strange haunted look in his eyes. Nothing, Mama, I was just thinking. This house has seen so much. That it has, I said. And God willing, it will see a great deal more. He didn't answer. He simply turned and walked away, leaving a silence in the room that felt cold and foreign. That night I could not sleep. I walked the halls of my home, running my hand along the familiar, cool plaster of the walls. I stopped by the portraits in the hallway, my children as babies, Arthur and I on our wedding day. These walls were not just structures. They were the pages of my life. They remembered everything. The sound of first cries and last breaths, of whispered secrets and joyous laughter. And as I stood there in the moonlight, a terrible, icy dread washed over me. Someone was about to try and tear the pages out. A week later, Benjamin sent a message to all of his siblings. It was not a phone call, but a formal, strangely worded email. He was requesting a mandatory family meeting, in the study. To discuss, he wrote, the final disposition of Arthur's primary asset and the future of the estate. David called me immediately, his voice sharp with confusion and suspicion. What is this, Mama? Primary asset. What is he talking about? It sounds like a corporate takeover, not Benjamin. I don't know, I said, my voice calmer than I felt. But I did know. In that moment, all the odd signs clicked into place. The hours in the study, the letters from lawyers, the haunted look in his eyes. The harbor I had felt so safe in was revealing itself to be a reef, and the ship of our newfound family peace was sailing straight for it. Of course, the stage is set in Arthur's study. Let us watch the curtain rise on this quiet, devastating performance. We gathered in the study not as a family, but as a board of directors summoned to a hostile takeover. The air, usually thick with the comforting scent of old books and leather, felt thin and sharp, charged with a nervous energy. David stood with his arms crossed, his face set in a scowl of corporate suspicion. Eleanor kept straightening the silver frame of a family photograph on the mantelpiece, her anxiety manifesting as a need for order. Samuel and Veronica sat together on the small sofa, their newfound peace looking fragile enough to shatter at a single harsh word. And then there was Benjamin, my artist. He stood behind Arthur's great mahogany desk, not sitting, which was a statement in itself. He was not a participant. He was the one presiding. On the polished wood in front of him lay a single, important-looking folder. He looked pale, but his eyes held a strange, fervent light I had never seen before. He began without pleasantries. Thank you all for coming. I know this is unusual, but I felt this was a conversation that required a certain formality. Get on with it, Ben, David said, his patience already worn thin. Your email sounded like a legal notice. What is this about the primary asset? Benjamin took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping over his siblings before finally, reluctantly, landing on me. This is about the house, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It's about what this house has become. He began to speak, and the words that came out were not my son's. They sounded like something rehearsed, something learned from a book about art and philosophy. He spoke of the house as a mausoleum of memory, a beautiful but heavy anchor that kept us all tethered to the past. He said that our family, having just navigated the painful truths of my husband's last promise, needed to be free of the ghosts that resided within these walls. "We cannot truly move forward," he said, his voice gaining a hollow, preachy cadence, "while we are living inside a monument to what was. True legacy isn't about preserving wood and stone. It's about liberating the future." I believe Dad understood that. He knew that beauty must evolve, that it cannot be kept under glass. Eleanor let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Liberating the future? Benjamin, what on earth are you talking about?" "This is Mama's home. It's our home. It's a collection of rooms filled with sad stories," he countered, his eyes flashing with that strange fire. "And I, for one, will not spend the rest of my life suffocating under the weight of it. It's time to release this energy. It's time to sell." The word sell dropped into the room like a stone into a deep well. For a moment there was only the sound of its echo. Samuel was the first to find his voice, a pained whisper. "Sell? Ben, you can't be serious. After everything we just went through, to bring this up now?" "It is because of what we just went through," Benjamin insisted, his voice rising. "Don't you see? We are trapped by Dad's secrets, his mistakes, his legacy. This house is the container for all of it. Breaking it apart is the only way to be truly free. And I suppose you'd use your share of the profits to fund your artistic freedom in some Paris loft?" David sneered, his face flushed with anger. "Don't dress up your greed and philosophy. It's the same ugly game, just with a different vocabulary. This isn't about greed," Benjamin shouted, slamming his hand down on the desk. "It's about vision. Something you would never understand." He then stopped, took a ragged breath, and opened the folder on the desk. He slid a thick vellum document out. It was a deed, an official deed to the house. "And," he said, his voice dropping to a cold, clinical tone, "it is my decision to make." He pushed the document to the center of the desk. My name was nowhere on it. In the place of the owner, 2 names were listed, Arthur Davies, and upon his death, Benjamin Davies, his son. The blood drained from my face. I felt Jessica's hand on my arm, steadying me. The children stared at the paper, speechless. David snatched it up, his eyes scanning the legal jargon, looking for a flaw, a loophole. This is impossible," he muttered. "When was this signed?" "Years ago," Benjamin said quietly. "Dad and I had a long talk here in this very room. He said that you, David, understood money, and Eleanor understood order. But he said that I, the artist, was the only one who understood the true meaning of legacy. He told me that a house was just a vessel and that when the time was right I would know what to do with it. He trusted my vision, so he had this drawn up to give me the final say, to protect the family's future from its obsession with the past. The story was beautiful. It was plausible. It painted Arthur as a wise, far-seeing patriarch, and Benjamin as his chosen spiritual heir. It was also a complete and utter lie. My mind was reeling, thrown back not just years, but decades, to the worst year of my marriage. I wasn't in the study anymore. I was in my bedroom, shivering with a fever that had lingered for weeks after a difficult miscarriage. Arthur and I had been fighting, the grief and stress creating a chasm between us. He had been terrified of losing me. In his fear, he had become controlling, making rash decisions. One night, during a particularly bitter argument about the future, about what would happen to the children if I were to die, he had shouted, "Fine. If you don't trust me to care for them, I will sign the whole damn house over to the gentlest of them all. I'll sign it to Benjamin." It was a threat, a foolish, angry gesture made in a moment of terror and grief. I never thought he had actually done it. Now, seeing the deed, I understood. He had gone to a lawyer the very next day, a grand dramatic act of a terrified husband. He had likely forgotten about it himself weeks later, once I had recovered and our life had returned to normal. He had tucked it away in a box in this study, a foolish memento of a dark time, and my son, my quiet, watchful son, had found it. And he had twisted its meaning, retrofitting it with a noble story to justify a selfish, cruel desire. David was shouting about lawyers. Eleanor was weeping. Samuel was trying to plead with his brother. But I saw only the truth, clear and cold as ice. I pushed myself away from Jessica's supporting hand. I walked to the desk and picked up the deed, my hand surprisingly steady. I looked at the date, confirming the memory. Yes, The year of the long fever. I then looked at my son, not with the fury of a betrayed mother, but with the profound sadness of a queen who must face a traitor in her own court. The document you hold is real. Benjamin, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. The room fell silent. I know the day your father signed it. I know the very pen he used, but it is meaningless. I placed the deed back on the polished mahogany. I met my son's shocked and guilty eyes. Because this house is not an inheritance, Benjamin. It is a promise I made to your dying father, and you will not force me to break it. My words fell into the stunned silence of the study, not with the crash of a thunderclap, but with the heavy final weight of a closing tomb. The deed, which moments before had been Benjamin's source of power, now looked like a flimsy, irrelevant piece of paper. Legal authority is a paltry thing when set against the sacred authority of a deathbed promise. Benjamin was the first to recover. Though his voice was unsteady, the philosophical certainty he had worn like a cloak now hanging in tatters around him. A promise? He stammered, a flush creeping up his neck. What promise? There's no record of it. This, he tapped the deed with a trembling finger, is legal. It's binding. Dad's signature is right there. Your father's signature is on many things, I said, my voice calm and low, yet it carried to every corner of the room. But his soul is in the promise he asked me to make when he knew his time was ending. I turned from him and spoke to all my children, my gaze moving from one to the other, pulling them back with me to that final, terrible week. You all remember how he was at the end. The strength that had filled this house for 50 years was leaving him, breath by breath. He was afraid, not of dying, but of leaving us, of leaving the chaos he knew he had sometimes created, the secrets, the rivalries. My eyes rested on Samuel and David. He knew he had set his sons against each other. He knew his pride had caused pain. I looked at Eleanor. He knew his strength had sometimes made you feel you had to be even stronger. I looked at James, my long-lost son, who was not present but was always in my heart. And he knew there were wounds even deeper than that. On his last night, I continued, my voice growing softer, the memory so vivid I could almost feel the scratch of the woolen blanket on his bed. When it was just the two of us, and the moon was high outside that window, he held my hand. His grip was so weak, like a little bird's. He made me tell him stories of when you were all children. He wanted to remember the good, the laughter in these halls, the sound of your feet running on the stairs. And then he grew very serious. He looked at me, and his eyes were so clear, clearer than they had been in months. Mary, he said, this house is you. It is your heart, made of wood and stone. It is the only thing that has ever held us all together. The money, the businesses, it will all be divided. It will be fought over. But not this, not the heart. I took a deep breath, the phantom scent of antiseptic and old roses filling my senses. He made me promise. He said, promise me, Mary. Promise me you will be the keeper of this house until your last breath. Promise me it will always be a refuge. That no matter how far they wander or how badly they fight, our children will always have a light to come home to. Do not let them sell it. Do not let them divide it. It is not an asset. It is an anchor. I gave him my word. I held his hand and swore on my life, and on my love for him and for all of you, that this house would stand as long as I did. I finished, and the only sound in the room was Eleanor's soft weeping. David, my hardened businessman son, was staring at the floor, his jaw tight, his eyes suspiciously bright. Samuel looked at his brother Benjamin with an expression of profound, wounded disbelief. You were there, Benjamin, Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. You were there that week. You sat by his bed. How could you do this, knowing that? Benjamin looked trapped. The noble vision he had constructed for himself was crumbling under the weight of this raw, sacred memory. He never said that to me, he insisted, though his voice lacked all conviction. He told me I understood legacy. He trusted me. He trusted your gentle heart, I said, my voice finally rising with a flash of righteous fire. He trusted that you of all people would never mistake a building for its soul. He did not give you that deed to empower you to destroy our home. He signed it in a moment of fear and anger, years before, when he was afraid of losing me. He gave it to you in the way a king might give a child a toy sword, a symbolic gesture. He never intended for you to use it to commit treason against the heart of this family. The word treason struck him like a physical blow. He flinched, his face ashen. I am not a traitor, he whispered, looking around at the accusing faces of his siblings. I was trying to free us. Free us from what? David roared, finally finding his voice. He threw the deed down on the desk. Free us from our history, from our memories, from the one place on earth that is ours? That is not freedom, Benjamin. That is vandalism. You speak of vision, but you are blind. You have been so busy staring at your own reflection in a puddle of fancy words that you have forgotten what family means. Benjamin had no answer. He stood isolated behind the desk, the weight of our collective history, of his father's true last wish, crushing him. The fervent light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrifying shame. He had come here to be a visionary, a liberator. And he had revealed himself to be nothing more than a foolish, selfish boy playing with legal documents he did not understand. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. Mama, but I was not ready to offer comfort. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too deep. This was not a misunderstanding like Charlotte's. This was a conscious choice, a twisting of a sacred trust. Your father's memory deserves better than this. Benjamin, I said, my voice once again quiet and cold. And this family, after all its battles, deserves better than this. The meeting is over. I turned, and without another glance at him, walked out of the study. One by one, his siblings followed me, leaving him alone in the room with the ghost of our father, the weight of my promise, and the useless, damning piece of paper in his hand. The quietest war had just been declared, and I did not yet know if there could be any survivors. The days that followed were the quietest I have ever known in that house. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the dead, heavy silence of a battlefield after the fighting is done, when the living are too shocked to speak. Benjamin remained isolated in his studio. He did not join us for meals. When we passed in the hall, he would not meet my eyes. The rest of the family treated him with a cold, wounded formality. The war was over. I had won, but my victory felt like ashes in my mouth. My family was broken once more. I could not sleep. I would walk the halls at night, the floorboards groaning under the weight of my sorrow. The promise I had made to Arthur, the one I had used as a shield to protect our home, now felt like the very sword that had cloven my family in two. Justice had been served, but grace was nowhere to be found. I knew this impasse could not hold. A mother cannot simply excommunicate her son. She must, in the end, understand him. One afternoon, driven by a need I could not name, I went to his studio. The door was unlocked. He was not there. The room was a mess, canvases turned to the wall, brushes left uncleaned. It was the room of a man whose spirit had been shattered. I had not come for a reason, but my eyes were drawn to his work desk. Amidst the clutter of charcoal sticks and tubes of paint, there was a small, simple silver frame lying face down. I had never seen it before. My hand trembled as I reached for it. I turned it over, and my breath caught in my chest. It was a photograph of a little girl, no older than 7 or 8. She had a mischievous smile and eyes that were a perfect, startling replica of my Benjamin's. Tucked behind the photo was a lock of fine sandy hair, tied with a blue ribbon. Who was this child? In all his years, Benjamin had never had a wife, never a serious partner that he had brought home. A cold dread, a mother's intuition, prickled my skin. I began to search the room, not out of anger now, but out of a desperate, terrifying need to know. In a drawer beneath a stack of sketches, I found a leather portfolio. It was not filled with art. It was filled with medical documents, bills from a children's hospital in the city, letters from a specialist, and a diagnosis that made the world tilt on its axis. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The little girl's name was Lily, and the prognosis was dire without an experimental treatment, a new form of therapy with a staggering cost. I looked at the estimated total at the bottom of the page, and the number was precise, familiar, and sickening. It was the exact market value of my house. Everything, in that horrifying instant, became clear. The frantic energy, the philosophical ramblings about liberating the future. He wasn't talking about our family's future. He was talking about hers. The deed was not a weapon of greed. It was a life raft for his dying daughter. My gentle son was not a traitor. He was a terrified father, fighting for his child's life in the only way he could imagine, cloaking his desperation in a flawed, foolish, and tragic plan. I took the portfolio and the photograph. I walked out of the studio and went directly to the study where my son now sat, staring out the window. I placed the items on the desk in front of him. He looked at them, then at me, and the composure he had been fighting to maintain for months finally, completely broke. He collapsed into himself, his body racked with deep, silent sobs. I did not admonish him. I did not ask why he had kept this secret. I simply sat in the chair opposite him and waited. When he could finally speak, the story poured out of him. A summer romance years ago. A woman who didn't want to be a part of our chaotic family. His decision to support his child from a distance, never wanting to burden us. And then the diagnosis, and the shame, the terror, the certainty that he, like all of Arthur's sons, was flawed and would have to solve his own mess. He couldn't bear to come to us as a beggar, so he tried to come as a visionary. That evening I called another family meeting. When the children were assembled in the living room, their faces grim and wary, Benjamin stood before them and told them everything. He told them about Lily. He told them of his shame and his fear. The anger in the room did not just dissolve. It was annihilated, replaced by a wave of shock, sorrow, and a fierce, protective love. David, my practical David, was already on his phone, looking up the doctors, talking about second mortgages. Eleanor was weeping, not for the house, but for the niece she never knew she had. But I held up my hand, silencing them. "You will not sell your homes," I said, my voice clear and strong. "And we will not sell this one." I looked at Benjamin. "You were right about one thing, my son. Your father was a man of vision, in his own complicated way." I then revealed the last and truest secret of the house. After the financial crisis all those years ago, after he nearly lost everything, your father learned a hard lesson. He became a wiser man. For the last decade of his life, he secretly funneled a portion of his profits into a separate trust. Not an investment, not part of the estate. He called it the Anchor Fund. It was to be touched by no one, for no reason, except in the case of a true life-or-death family crisis. He made me its sole executor. He said I would know the moment when it was needed. I looked around the room at my stunned children. I never spoke of it because its existence was not for funding businesses or settling disputes. It was for this. It was for a moment just like this. It was for Lily. The surprise was not that my gentle son had betrayed me. The surprise was that my flawed husband had, in the end, provided the salvation. The house was safe. More importantly, my granddaughter would be saved. The crisis that had threatened to be the final undoing of the Davies family had, in a way none of us could have predicted, become the event that bound us together with a new and unbreakable purpose. The walls of this house did not just remember the past. They had forced us to build a future. Mary's voice shifts, becoming the warm narrator one last time. And so, my dears, the story of the deed comes to a close. It is a strange thing, is it not? How an act that seems like the greatest betrayal can sometimes be a desperate act of love. And how the ghosts of the past are not always there to haunt us. Sometimes they are there to save us. Thank you for walking this path with me. Your companionship makes the memories lighter. If this story of our family's surprising turn has moved you, please do press that like button and subscribe so that we may meet again. Tell me, in the comments below, what you thought of Benjamin's secret. And now the page turns once more. What story should these walls tell next? Should we finally speak of my pragmatic daughter, Catherine, and the patient she was never supposed to love? Or is it time to tell the story of Jessica, my loyal daughter-in-law, and the secret she kept for her husband, David, a secret that almost cost them everything? Let me know your thoughts. Until next time, hold your family close, and do not be afraid to look behind the anger. Sometimes that is where you will find the love.